about Chinese book because of Orientalism, because despite the fact that it's world renowned, I don't think that aspect of the book has been made clear enough. How structurally, when Orientalism is taken over by the latest Orientalist nation, like the United States, it self-destructs, and that is manifest in the tremendous difference between, say, Ernest Renan, who constitutes that middle phase, and what Said never tires referring to the American Orientalists as experts, the pundits, the pundit mentality, which is, from Said's point of view, self-parodic, and therefore could be easily identified with Foucault's notion of genealogy in the parodic mode, where the logic in fulfilling itself self-destructs, unrealizes itself. What the fiction that has become real now unrealizes itself. That's exactly the pattern, structural pattern of Orientalism, and that's why I'm taking pains to point that out. And you see that, and my point, of course, is that something that I've been saying all along in this class, which we must be, in everything we think and say about the world in which we live, that it's a interregnum stage. The world is dying, but not dead, as America makes clear, but is dying, and a new world struggling to be born. That to me is very crucial, and why a book like Orientalism is, if you're attuned to that, will become automatic. You see that how Orientalism is proleptic of our consciousness, our global consciousness, 50 years later, 40 years later. He says this in the 1970s. Anyway, that, and as I've been saying, the relation between Orientalism, Said's Orientalism, and Foucault's analysis of modernity as that moment when power, knowledge and power come to be seen as complicit. Whereas in an earlier period, as we've said, in an earlier period, it was the belief, or it was the assertion, representation of the dominant culture to say that the truth will set us free from power. The truth will set us free from power. Uh, and of course, this truth that that will set us free is, as we've been seeing all along from the very beginning in this class, a lie, a fiction, a construct. But again, you know, I keep coming back to this, and I think it's worth keep coming back to, and that's the idea that, after all, what is reality anyway? Is reality something that is other than a representation? Isn't reality, as it's represented, particularly a fiction? But this is what we have come to discover in the period of post-structuralist moment. This is what we've come to discover, that the truth is a fiction. But what needs to be emphasized is that, despite the fact it's a fiction, this fiction, this lie, produces reality. It's the world we live in. It produces the world we live in. So in that sense, that's why that word in Foucault's Nietzsche genealogy history is so important. Our unrealization. That's why that word is so important. That's why the key, the crux, it seems to me, the crux of the educational process at this particular moment in the interregnum has got to be on the issue of reality. What is reality? What is reality? What is the truth? And of course, the recognition that the truth is a lie. But and at this point, Said, the part of that aspect of Said structurally, we've been talked about last time, the Napoleonic invasion is so telling, and beyond. It's so telling. It manifests. It makes clear. It shows the process of the truth becoming a lie becoming the truth. Manifest. And shows it in such a way that it discloses its complicity with power, because two armies go to France, to Egypt. A military army, Napoleon's military army, but he also said an army of savants, of intellectuals. Why? Because Napoleon knew that the best way of conquering is not through the overt use of power, at least in part. He had a sense of this, and not by conquering, by the use of force, but through knowledge production. And so what we get here, and this is why Said gives such overdetermines, gives such emphasis to this moment in the book. It's, of course, at the heart of the book. It's the pivotal point of the book, structurally speaking, the Napoleonic expedition. Because we see the beginning of a momentum of mode conquest, the development of a apparatus of capture, which employs knowledge production, scientific knowledge production, as its fundamental means. Once this becomes prominent, this mode becomes triumphant, then slowly but surely you can withdraw the apparatuses of overt uses of power, as in the case in that next generation of Orientalists who are characterized by Sassy and Renan, Massignon, and so on and so forth, both in England, France, and both in England and France, who are political scientists or linguistic scientists, not political figures, who sit at their desks in England, in France, in England, in Paris, in London, and analyze, in the case of Renan, of course, the Semitic languages. And through the analysis, the objective, quote unquote, disinterested analysis of Semitic languages proves to the West and to the Orient that the Oriental world, in all its manifestations, particularly their language, is degenerate. So you don't need power. Once you articulate the truth of the difference between Western languages and Oriental languages, then you don't need armies. That's what Said is getting at. And that is exactly analogous to Foucault's genealogy of the disciplinary society. Before, you needed power. You needed overt power. After, you don't. After the establishment of the panoptic structure, you don't. The object of this power becomes his own, her own prisoner. It becomes incarcerated within him or herself. You don't need apparatuses of power. The analogy in my mind is absolute between Foucault and Said here. Although the difference, as I said last time, is that Said applies that apparatus, that power, that knowledge-power relation to the relationship, which Foucault did not, the relationship between the West and the Orient, the Occident and the Orient. On page 81, the Orientalism. Napoleon enlistment of several dozen savants from his Egyptian expedition is too well known to require detail here. His idea was to build a sort of living archive for the expedition. Here again, that word, living archive, derives from Foucault, who established, prior to his book, Discipline and Punishment, the concept of the library as fundamental to the Western tradition and the mode of power it developed in the process. The archive becomes absolutely crucial. But what is an archive? An archive is a selection, and the word arche, the beginning, in that sense of the word beginning, monumental, in the notion of monumental. The archive is a selection of texts that are worthy of being remembered, put in libraries. Those that are not worthy of being remembered, are not archival, gets lost in history. Gets lost in history. So Foucault established this notion of the archive as a symbol of a mode of knowledge production, which is one fictitious in the sense it's a selection in opposition to texts that are not selected, only those that fit the preconception, the telos, are archivalized. And of course, it's a fiction that we're talking about knowledge production, a library, which is the holder of the truth. It's the holder of the truth. This is where the truth resides, in the library that is established by Western civilization. That's why the term archive is got to be seen in the light of Foucault's analysis here, when he said, his idea was to build a sort of living archive for the expedition in the form of studies conducted on all topics by the members of the Institut d'Egypte, which he founded. He founded it. This emperor, this guy who was oriented by a vision of conquest, world conquest. He founded this archive. He founded this institute which had as its fundamental purpose the dissemination of the truth to humanity. That's the great irony that not only the great irony but also the great discovery that Said makes along with Foucault. That absolute connection between power and knowledge and power. And this was systematic, as Said goes on to show. This was absolutely systematic. It was published in, let's go on here. What was perhaps less well known is Napoleon's prior reliance upon the work of Comte de Volney, a French traveler whose Voyage en Égypte et en Syrie appeared in 2 volumes of 1787. That's that textual attitude which I consider the origins of this much more sophisticated version. Aside from a short personal preface informing the reader that the acquisition of some money, his inheritance made it possible to take the trip east in 1783. Volney's voyage is an almost oppressively impersonal document. Volney evidently saw himself as a scientist whose job it was always to record the état of something he saw. The climax of the voyage occurred in the second volume, an account of Islam as a religion. Volney's views were canonically hostile to Islam as a religion and as a system of political institutions. Nevertheless, Napoleon found this work and Volney's Considérations sur la guerre actuelle du Turcs of particular importance. Volney, after all, was a canny Frenchman, and like Chateaubriand and Lamartine, a quarter century after him, he eyed the New Orient. Notice Said's use of that visual language to talk about something that you cannot see, but who comes to the Orient as someone who sees it. Again, to indicate that what I was saying last time, that despite Said's the lack in Said of reference to the onto-theological, the metaphysical tradition, the onto tradition, is there in his discourse, in his rhetoric. As a likely place for the realization of French colonial ambition. What Napoleon profited from, as in Volney, was the enumeration in ascending order of difficulty of the obstacles to be faced in the Orient by any French expeditionary force. Napoleon refers explicitly to Volney in his reflections on the Egyptian expedition, Campagne d'Égypte et de Syrie, which he dictated to General Bertrand on St. Helena. This is to indicate how this general, military general, came to recognize in a very revolutionary way, unlike most generals in the past, how useful the truth is. I shouldn't say that Napoleon, Said also tells us that one of Napoleon's heroes was Alexander the Great. And also, you remember, wasn't, if I remember correctly, didn't Aristotle accompany Alexander the Great on his expedition to Persia? Yeah, he did. Although, and that obviously is must have registered as an early manifestation of that. The only point that I would make to qualify is that this does not jeopardize, this does not interfere with the theory that I offered by way of my analysis of Heidegger's essay on humanism, Parmenides, in which my claim is that the Greeks were not imperial and did not use knowledge in that way. You have to remember that Heidegger makes it very clear that the Romans, in modifying the Greek concept of aletheia, by way of substituting veritas, the adequation of mind and thing, is that they got their understanding of the Greeks that they're following. The Romans got their understanding from the Greeks they're following, from the late Greeks, which is to say the era of the post great moment of Greek civilization, the moment of what Heidegger calls when philosophy goes to the schools, becomes scholarly in the Alexandrian period, and in the period of Alexander the Great. But that again is an issue that I don't want to get into. What's important for our purposes is that what Said is offering us here in a kind of way that is mind-blowing, really, is how this general, whose whole orientation is military, is force, is violence, could have come to this recognition that maybe a more efficient way than violence is through knowledge. That's what's interesting. And that's why, to me, this moment in Orientalism is such a great moment. He shows that the continuity between this moment when all of a sudden Western science becomes the means, the best means, most efficient means of achieving power over another, by way of those moments in his childhood or in his youth, when he's reading these guys who have visited the Orient, like Lamartine and Volney and so on, so forth, and thus indicating the continuity between the textual attitude, as he defines it at the beginning of that chapter, and the more scientific orientation, the continuity, how we got from Lamartine and Chateaubriand and Volney to Sassy and Ernest Renan and the great schools of Orientalism that have been fundamental. We call them now, or universities call them now, area studies. Area studies. And of course, if you know anything about the way the Orient has been represented since it became, by the West, and particularly in America, you know that representation has come from these area study schools. Little anecdote, by the way. When Said's Orientalism began making an impact on in universities, a member of the Hoover Institute, which is a think tank, a conservative think tank at Stanford University, I forget his name. I wish I could remember his name. Nevertheless, was invited by Congress, American Congress, a branch of the American Congress, concerning funding for federal funding for studies, and this one particularly the area of funding area studies. And this guy, what's his name? Can't remember. Was asked to answer questions by this board. And one of the points he made is that Said's Orientalism is a book that is shattering the unity of area studies in the American universities, and therefore constitutes a very great threat to the security of the United States, and must be repressed. This is what this area studies expert told the Congress. To indicate how crucial area studies, as they have been developed in America, have been to American foreign policy in Israel, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, in general. Napoleon refers explicitly to Volney in his reflection on the Egyptian expedition Campagne d'Égypte et de Syrie, which he dictated to General Bertrand on Saint Helena. Volney, he said, considered that there were three barriers to French hegemony in the Orient, and in that any French force would therefore have to fight three wars, one against England, a second against the Ottoman Porte, and the third, the most difficult, against the Muslims. Volney's assessment was both shrewd and hard to fault, since it was clear to Napoleon, as it would be to anyone who read Volney, that his Voyage and the Considerations were effective texts to be used by any European wishing to win the Orient. In other words, Volney's work constituted a handbook. The whole world of Islam, past and future, contained within this small handbook, in the same way that enables to see the Orient virtually all at once. For attenuating, Volney's work constituted a handbook for attenuating the human shock a European might feel as he directly experienced the Orient, which is to say, a world radically more complicated than that handbook represents it. Read the books seems to have been Volney's thesis, and far from being disoriented by the Orient, you will be compelled to it. Napoleon took Volney almost literally, but in a characteristically subtle way. From the first moment that the Armée d'Égypte appeared on the Egyptian horizon, every effort was made to convince the Muslims that nous sommes les vrais musulmans. We, French, are the true Muslims. By the way, you must have heard, you must hear that, the analogy of President Kennedy's speech to the Germans at the fall of the wall of Berlin. Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner. Where did that come from? Where did he get that from? It's part of the archive. It's part of the truth discourse of America. It goes all the way back to this moment right here. Nous sommes les vrais musulmans, as Bonaparte's proclamation of July 2, 1798 put it to the people of Alexandria. Equipped with a team of Orientalists and sitting on board a French flagship called the Orient, Napoleon used Egyptian enmity towards the Mamelukes and appealed to the revolutionary idea of equal opportunity for all to wage a uniquely benign and selective war against Islam. This, by the way, is worth pausing for a minute to add another dimension, which I'm thinking is fundamental to Said's discourse, and that's the notion of ventriloquizing, and it has to me, what's important about this notion of ventriloquizing a native. It's important to me because that is the fundamental technique that America has been using ever since its engagement with the Middle East. Regime change, and before that, of course, in Vietnam as well, for example, where you change the regime by way not of putting Americans in to run the country, but ventriloquize natives who represent, quote unquote, the people, the Vietnamese people or the Arab people themselves. Again, that is an aspect of Said's discourse that is very prominent, fundamental for him in his analysis of the relation between how power operates between West and East. I think, for example, probably the most important moment in Said's writing where this issue emerges full force in his Culture and Imperialism, where particularly in his analysis of the great British imperialist novelist Rudyard Kipling's Kim, where at a certain moment in the novel, Kipling has to deal with the great Indian Revolution against British imperial rule, called the Sepoy Rebellion of 1858. And in order to show that the British response, which was violent and total and absolute, ruthless, brutal, and massive, was justified. How does he do it? He's not in his own voice. He has Kim, the protagonist, the old lama, an old lama who sort of has that sense of authority that comes from being a lama. And this former member of the Sepoy Army, Indian member of the Sepoy Army. And in the process of the story, the process of the novel, Kipling puts the defense of the British response to the Sepoy Rebellion in the mouth of this Indian, not the white man, but Indian. And Said says, in the real world of India, this guy, who is represented as the spokesperson for the Indian people, the majority of the Indian people, would have been considered a traitor, would have been considered, to put it mildly, not a very good authority about the truth of the Sepoy Rebellion. But the way Kipling puts it strategically, by way of ventriloquizing his voice, this Indian, all of that sort of just fades out as an option, as an alternative way of seeing that context. What Napoleon is trying to do here, according to Said, is produce these ventriloquized regimes, and make them think that that they're being self-determined, because the people who run these governments are natives themselves, not Westerners, not agents of authority from another world. Again, what Said is talking about here is one of those moments in Western civilization in which a whole momentum different from the past emerges as a means of efficient conquest. And I referred to the example, for example, when America America intervened in Vietnam, it created puppet regime, Diem, and then one right after the other. When those didn't work, they throw them out, put new ones in. But always natives, always natives. And Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq. Trouble is, of course, those always backfire. They always backfire. But theoretically, they're intended to work. Equipped with a team of Orientalists and sitting on board a flagship called the Orient, Napoleon used Egyptian enmity towards the Mandalorian appeal to the revolutionary idea of equal opportunity for all to wage a uniquely benign and selective war against Islam. What more than anything else impressed the first Arab chronicler of the expedition, Abdul al-Rahman al-Jabarti, was Napoleon's use of scholars to manage his contacts with the natives, that and the impact of watching a modern European intellectual establishment at close quarters. Napoleon tried everywhere to prove that he was fighting for Islam. Everything he said was translated into Quranic Arabic, just as the French army was urged by his command always to remember the Islamic sensibility. Compare in this regard Napoleon's tactics in Egypt with the tactics of the Requerimiento, a document drawn up in 1530 in Spanish by the Spaniards to be read aloud to the Indians. we shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such sell and depose them as their highness the king and queen of Spain may demand. And we shall take away your goods, and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can, as to vassals who do not obey, etc., etc., etc. All of this happening at this very particular crux moment. It wasn't much earlier when the Spanish produced this requerimento and as a means of cowing the natives into quiescence by threat or violence, and this new movement. So again, the analogy is between the analogy with Foucault is absolute when we think of Foucault's distinction between the monarchical ancien regime and the modern bourgeois, capitalist, democratic regime of truth. When it seemed obvious to Napoleon that his force was too small to impose itself on Egyptians, he then tried to make the local imams, qadis, muftis, and ulemas interpret the Quran in favor of the Grande Armée. To this end, the 60 ulemas who taught at the Azhar were invited to his quarters, given full military honors, and then allowed to be flattered by Napoleon's admiration for Islam and Muhammad, and by his obvious veneration for the Quran, with which he seemed perfectly familiar. This worked, and soon the population of Cairo, he succeeded in his ventriloquizing activity. This worked, and soon the population of Cairo seemed to have lost its distrust of the occupiers. Napoleon later gave his deputy Kleber strict instructions after he left, always to administer Egypt through the Orientalists and the religious Islamic leaders whom they could win over. Any other politics was too expensive and foolish. Page 83, a couple paragraphs there. But dealing with these Muslims was only a part of Napoleon's project to dominate Egypt. The other part was to render it completely open, to make it totally accessible to European scrutiny. There's that surveillance eye again. From being a land of obscurity and a part of the Orient hitherto known as second-hand through the exploits of earlier travelers, scholars, and conquerors, Egypt was to become a department of French learning. It's not simply that Napoleon brought with him an army of intellectuals. This was intended as the beginning of an institutionalization of this learning. It took its most immediate form in those 12, 20 volumes of scientific analysis of every single detail of Egyptian life, published by the French Institute that he established for professing this purpose. The other part was to render it completely open, to make it totally accessible to European scrutiny, from being a land of obscurity and a part of the Orient hitherto known at second hand through the explorers of earlier travelers, scholars and conquerors, Egypt was to become a department of learning. Here too, the textual and schematic attitudes are evident. The Institute, with its team of chemists, historians, biologists, archaeologists, surgeons, and antiquarians, was the learned division of the army. His job was no less aggressive, to put Egypt into modern French, to translate Egypt into modern French. And unlike the Abbé Le Mascrier, 1735, Description de l'Égypte, Napoleon's was to be a universal undertaking. Almost from the first moments of the occupation, Napoleon saw to it that the Institute began its meetings with experiments and fact-finding mission, as it would be called today. Most important, everything said, seen, and studied was to be recorded, and indeed was recorded in that great collective appropriation of one country by another, takeover. The Description de l'Égypte, published in 23 volumes, enormous volumes, between 1809 and 1928. I will conclude this discussion of Said's account of the Napoleon's expedition by way of the summary, if I can find it. Yeah. The summary of, his summary of the 29 volumes, 23 volumes of the Description de l'Égypte. His summary is extraordinary in its precision and its force and its irresistible dynamics. On page 86. This is a list of what the accomplishments intended by the Description. To restore a region from its present barbarism to its former classical greatness. To instruct, for its own benefit, the Orient in the ways of the modern West. To subordinate or underplay military power in order to aggrandize the project of glorious knowledge acquired in the process of political domination of the Orient. To formulate the Orient, to give it shape, identity, definition, with full recognition of its place in memory, its importance to imperial strategy, and its natural role as an appendage to Europe. To dignify all the knowledge collected during colonial occupation with the title Contribution to Modern Learning, to the truth. When the natives had neither been consulted nor treated as anything except as pretext for a text whose usefulness was not to the natives. To feel oneself a European in command almost at will of Oriental history. Time, and geography. To institute new areas of specialization, to establish new disciplines, to divide, deploy, schematize, tabulate, index, and record everything in sight and out of sight. I'm going to come back to this just in a second. That particular moment in the list. To make out of to make out of every observable detail a generalization, and out of every generalization a immutable law about the Oriental nature, temperament, and mentality, custom of type. And above all, to transmute living reality into the stuff of texts. To possess, or think one possesses, actuality, mainly because nothing in the Orient seems to resist one's power. These, conclude, are the features of Orientalist projection entirely realized by the description diligée, itself enabled and reinforced by Napoleon's wholly Orientalist engulfment of Egypt by the instruments of Western knowledge and power. Thus, Fourier concludes his preface to the Institute, the description. His preface by announcing that history will remember how Egypt was the theater of Napoleon's glory, and preserves, without forgetting, all the circumstances of this extraordinary event. I want to come back to that moment which I highlighted in this list. To establish new disciplines, to divide, deploy, schematize, tabulate, index, and record everything in sight and out of sight. Said there is referring to one of the fundamental characteristics. We didn't get a chance to talk about this, at least I don't remember. Fundamental characteristic of Foucault's analysis of the disciplinary society, of the apparatuses that became fundamental and prominent and fundamental as apparatuses of knowledge production and capture. And that is the table, as in, for example, the periodic table, or the table, the tableau, as Foucault called it, tableau vivant, the living table, which is the most telling development of the metaphysical mode of knowledge production. In the sense that the table, you say, take, for example, the periodic table. What's a periodic table? A periodic table is literally a diagram in which you can see every single element that makes up the whole universe in one picture. All of being is contained in that diagram, but in such a way that every element is distinguished from the other. Every element has its own authority, has its own uniqueness. But what is most important, and what has always been until recently, people like Foucault, not attended to, is the fact that that unique element is such that it must take its proper place in the larger whole. It has to be subjected It's a subject that has to be subjected to the larger whole. What was emphasized by those who celebrated this kind of table, and Foucault tells us, of course, that this kind of table was applied to every single part of life. He chooses three moments: the biological, the economic, and the political. Discipline and punishment. But these tables were fundamental to the emergence of modernity. And in every single case, there of course diagrams of power. But what these guys emphasized, what these who celebrated emphasized, was this is such a great device of knowledge production, because once we establish the identity of a single element and see it in relationship to the establishment and other elements around it, these blank spaces can be predicted. The reality of those blank spaces can be predicted. Well, of course, that had enormous efficiency in the gaining of knowledge about the elements of being of the earth. But when this table was transferred to, say, educational system, to the political system, to the economic system, then the negative consequences manifest itself, and this is where Foucault came in to show that there's no difference between that periodic table and the panopticon, which separates out the individual so that they can be examined from each other, so they can be scrutinized and examined, and for the purposes of reforming them. This is what I'm absolutely certain Said is referring to, that moment in Said, in Foucault's analysis of the disciplinary society, where he invokes the tableau vivant, the table. Of course, his main example is not the periodic table. That's my example. His example, Foucault's example, of course, is the Buffon and who's the biologist? I'm blocking. Who tableized the flora and fauna of the earth. Buffon was one of them, but the more famous is who? Can you help me? God. It'll come to me somewhere along the line. It doesn't matter.
Linnaeus?
The point is clear. That Said is thinking very specifically throughout this whole list of accomplishments of the Institute and its 23 volumes. This one here, particularly concerning the dividing, deploying, schematizing, tabulating, indexing, and recording everything in sight and out of sight. Okay, so it's at this point that, see, I don't have my phone in my, anyone tell me what time it is, how much time we have?
12:48.
12:40? Okay.
48, yeah.
48, okay. Let me know when the time is up. It's at this point, of course, that Said moves from that in-between stage, textual attitude, and the Napoleonic expedition, which includes both intellectual armies and military armies, to that moment in Western Oriental history, in the genealogy of Western Oriental history, when you can do away with the military and rely simply on knowledge. And again, to make Said's long story short, he is talking, when he's talking about Sassi and particularly Renan, he is talking about truth. He is talking about an orientation towards gaining knowledge about being, which is assumed to be an orientation that the consequence of which is the truth. And what Said is saying is that it's a lie. That it's a lie. This truth discourse is a lie. And Said dramatizes that, I don't know if dramatize is not the right word, but prefaces this, his analysis of this great linguistic scientist who had so much to do with determining the West's understanding through the difference between the Aryan and the Semitic languages, the West's attitude towards the Orient. All of the area study programs in France and England and later in America were modeled on Renan's investigations. He prefaces, in order to make a point about the lie of the truth of Orientalism, he prefaces it by telling us a little bit about Renan's personal background. I'm not going to go into this except to say what's crucial about it, and that is that Renan, in the process of his linguistic investigation, who had been a Christian before, could no longer maintain his belief, his faith in Christianity. He became a scientist. But what Said shows beautifully through the discourse of Renan himself is that, and this is a very, very important aspect of, or introduces a very important aspect of Said's own orientation, one we've talked about before and we'll continue to talk about, the notion of the secular, the the motion to separate. He says that despite the fact that Renan lost his faith in Christianity, he nevertheless models his analysis of the Semitic and Aryan languages according to the pattern, the frame of reference of Christianity. Said, invoking a term that at that moment was being highlighted by way of the publication of a book by this Cornell scholar, Meyer Abrams, on actually about romantic poetry, the heritage of the legacy of romantic poetry, which he entitled Natural Supernaturalism. Natural Supernaturalism. Said picks up on that to show that, yes, Renan abandoned his faith in Christianity, but not the structure, the ontological structure that determined the Christian representation of being. It becomes a naturalized supernaturalism that's brought into the world. The analogy is exactly again with that of Foucault's distinction between the monarchical regime and the capitalist bourgeois regime in its movement away from the power orientation of the theological eye and the incorporation of that eye into the object of power, the people themselves, the deviant, the reformers themselves. So they become their own prisoners of their own self. Natural supernaturalism. I want to emphasize that in Said's analysis of Renan and this crucial moment in the development of Orientalism, knowledge prediction of the Orient. Because, as I said a little bit earlier, this notion of the secular, which he so brilliantly in this passage shows is tainted by a metaphysical perspective. Later on, Said how can I put it? Too loosely celebrates the secular without clarifying that distinction he made, crucial distinction he made, between Renan's version of the secular, which is his natural supernaturalism, and this other secular that Said is positing against that kind of natural supernaturalism. It's hard for me to understand why Said didn't make so much more of that, or to try to articulate much more clearly. Well then, what do you mean by a secular? Even in the book that I think I've had you read, Humanism and Contemporary Criticism, he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He leaves that a problem. And to me, as you have probably inferred by this time, everything is at stake in making that clear. What do you mean by the secular? That's why I mean you referred, in order to distinguish from the secular as sort of vaguely presented by Said, why I've been invoking God and using the word profane. That gives it much less resonance with the supernatural. The profane is, unlike the secular, after all, the word secular itself is very closely associated with theological. So, all right, anyway, I'll stop here. We're pretty much running across. I'll come back to Renan the next time.